My name is Dennis, and at 57 years old, I thought I knew my son Marcus pretty well. After working 30 years in insurance, I'd developed a sixth sense for when something wasn't quite right. But nothing prepared me for what happened during my visit to Portland last month. Marcus took me to this small pub called The Anchor, said he wanted to discuss something important about our future together. The whole evening felt off from the moment we walked through that door. When he stepped away to take a phone call, the bartender grabbed my hand and whispered a warning that made my blood run cold. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe because what I'm about to tell you will change how you view family trust forever. Marcus is my 29-year-old son, and our relationship has been strained ever since his mother Sarah and I went through a bitter divorce 7 years ago. That split was one of those nasty court battles that dragged on for 18 months, with lawyers arguing over everything from custody schedules to who got the coffee maker. Sarah won primary custody, leaving me with alternate weekends and major holidays. Not exactly the foundation for a strong father-son relationship. The worst part was watching Marcus get caught in the middle of our adult problems. He was 22, then old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough to be deeply affected by all the anger and resentment flying around our house. Sarah had a talent for painting me as the villain in every situation. She told Marcus I cared more about my insurance clients than my own family, that I worked late to avoid spending time at home, that I was emotionally unavailable and selfish. Some of those accusations stung because they contained grains of truth. I did throw myself into work after we separated, partly to avoid the crushing loneliness of my empty apartment. When Marcus moved to Portland 3 years ago for a software development position, our communication became even more sporadic. We'd exchange brief phone calls, maybe once a month, conversations that felt stilted and formal. He'd update me on his job, I'd tell him about retirement planning, and we'd both pretend the awkwardness wasn't suffocating us. Deep down, I carried tremendous guilt about failing as a father. I'd lie awake wondering if I could have fought harder in court, if I should have moved to Oregon to be closer to him, if there were opportunities to rebuild our relationship that I'd missed out of pride or stubbornness. So when Marcus called me 3 weeks ago and invited me to visit Portland, I was genuinely shocked. His voice sounded different, more mature somehow, but there was also a distance I couldn't quite identify. He said he'd been doing some thinking about family, about the importance of having strong relationships as we both got older. He wanted to spend some quality time together, maybe discuss some plans for the future. I booked a flight from Chicago that same afternoon. The 3-hour flight felt endless. I kept replaying our phone conversation, analyzing every word and tone. Something about the way he spoke seemed rehearsed, like he'd practiced what he was going to say. But I pushed those doubts aside, telling myself I was being paranoid because I wanted this reconciliation so badly. When I spotted Marcus at the Portland airport baggage claim, my first reaction was concern. He looked significantly thinner than I remembered, almost gaunt. Dark circles shadowed his eyes and his clothes hung loose on his frame like he'd lost 20 pounds. We hugged, but it felt mechanical, like embracing a distant relative at a funeral. During the 40-minute drive from the airport to his neighborhood, I tried asking about his health, his work, whether he was eating properly. Marcus deflected most of my questions with vague responses about being busy with projects and working long hours. Instead, he kept steering the conversation toward my situation. How was retirement treating me? Had I been managing my finances well? Did I have a current will? Had I thought about what would happen to my assets if something happened to me? These seemed like unusual topics for a reunion conversation, but I figured maybe he was genuinely concerned about my welfare as I entered my senior years. After all, I was his only immediate family besides Sarah, and she and I certainly weren't going to coordinate our end-of-life planning. That evening, Marcus suggested we grab dinner and drinks at a place he knew. The Anchor, he called it. Said it was a quiet spot where we could really talk without distractions. The Anchor turned out to be tucked away in a residential neighborhood that had seen better days. The building looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, with dark wood siding and small windows that barely let in any light. Inside, the atmosphere was definitely quiet, but in an unsettling way rather than cozy. Maybe 8 or 10 other customers were scattered around tables, most of them sitting alone and nursing drinks in silence. Marcus chose a corner table that gave him a clear view of the front entrance. I noticed he kept checking his phone and glancing toward the door every few minutes, like he was expecting someone or worried about someone walking in. We ordered food and drinks. I got a burger and a Budweiser, trying to keep things casual and familiar. Marcus ordered just a club sandwich, but only drank water, which struck me as odd for a 29-year-old guy having dinner with his father. The conversation started innocently enough. Marcus asked about my adjustment to retirement, whether I was staying busy if I missed the insurance business. But then his questions became increasingly specific and personal. He wanted to know exact details about my pension benefits, my savings account balances, my investment portfolio. When I asked how he knew some of these financial details, he said Sarah had mentioned them during their phone calls. But I knew for a fact that Sarah and I hadn't discussed money in years, and she definitely didn't know about some of the accounts he referenced. Then Marcus started demonstrating knowledge about my personal life that really unsettled me. He mentioned my doctor's name, knew about a minor medical procedure I'd had 6 months ago. Even referenced a conversation I'd had with my neighbor about potentially selling my house. This information wasn't the kind of thing that would come up in casual mother-son phone calls. The bartender working that night was a guy who looked to be in his mid-40s with graying hair and watchful eyes. His name tag read Jake. Throughout our meal, I noticed Jake paying unusual attention to our table. Every time he restocked glasses or wiped down surfaces, he'd position himself where he could observe Marcus and me. At first, I thought maybe we were being too loud or disruptive, but we were actually speaking pretty quietly. Around 8:30, Marcus received a phone call that he took a few steps away from our table. I could hear him speaking in low tones, but couldn't make out specific words. It sounded like he was confirming plans or giving someone an update about timing. While he was occupied with the call, Jake moved closer to our area, ostensibly cleaning tables, but clearly listening to whatever he could overhear. When Marcus returned from his call, his entire demeanor had shifted. The nervous, uncertain young man I'd been talking to was replaced by someone more focused and determined. He started talking about financial planning strategies that would benefit both of us, estate management techniques that could save thousands in taxes. He pulled out a briefcase from under the table that I hadn't noticed him carrying and saying he'd brought some paperwork for me to review. Other customers in the bar were starting to pay attention to us too. An elderly woman sitting near the window kept staring at Marcus, then at me with an expression I couldn't read. A younger couple at a table near the bar seemed to be eavesdropping on our conversation, whispering to each other between glances in our direction. The whole atmosphere felt charged with tension, like everyone in the room was waiting for something to happen. When Marcus excused himself to use the men's room, Jake immediately abandoned whatever he'd been doing behind the bar and walked straight to our table. He grabbed an empty glass and started wiping the surface, but leaned in close enough that I could feel his breath on my ear. "Your son isn't who you think he is," Jake whispered urgently, his eyes darting toward the bathroom door. "He's been here 3 times this week with different men, all of them older like you." My stomach dropped to my shoes. "What do you mean?" I managed to whisper back. Jake pulled out his smartphone and quickly scrolled through what appeared to be security camera footage from the bar. The images were grainy but clear enough to make out faces and general details. In the first photo, Marcus was sitting at a table near the window with an elderly man wearing a blue vest and gray slacks. The man looked to be in his early 60s with white hair and nervous body language. In the second image, Marcus sat across from a different man, this one balding and wearing a brown cardigan sweater, probably mid-50s. "Police found the first man's car in the Willamette River last month." Jake continued, speaking as fast as he could while keeping his voice low. "His name was Harold Peterson. Family thought it was an accident, that maybe he'd had a medical emergency while driving and went off the bridge. But there were things about the scene that didn't make sense to investigators." I stared at the photos, trying to process what Jake was telling me. "And the second man, Robert Chen, disappeared 2 weeks ago. His daughter filed a missing person report after he didn't show up for Sunday dinner. She said he'd mentioned meeting someone about an investment opportunity, but he never came home. Police haven't found his body yet." The bathroom door opened across the room, and Jake quickly pocketed his phone. "Check his jacket pockets when he sits down," he whispered. "Look for anything unusual, and whatever you do, don't drink anything else he offers you. The sedatives work fast." Jake moved away just as Marcus returned to our table, but not before adding one final warning: "If you get a chance to leave, take it. Don't go anywhere alone with him." Marcus sat back down with a completely transformed expression. Gone was any trace of uncertainty or nervousness. He was smiling widely, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. It reminded me of the most manipulative insurance salesmen I'd worked with over the years, people who could turn charm on and off like a light switch. "Sorry about that, Dad," he said, signaling Jake for 2 fresh drinks. "Just work stuff. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was because Marcus had never talked about his job requiring phone calls at 8:30 on a Tuesday night. As he gestured toward Jake, I noticed his jacket had fallen slightly open, revealing the edge of what looked like a small plastic bag containing white pills in his inside pocket. For the first time since arriving in Portland, I was genuinely afraid. Marcus returned to our table carrying 2 fresh beers, setting one directly in front of me with an enthusiasm that felt completely artificial. "Let's make a proper toast," he said, raising his glass with theatrical flair. "To family, to second chances, and to new beginnings." I remembered Jake's specific warning about not drinking anything Marcus offered me. I lifted my glass but barely allowed it to touch my lips, pretending to take a sip while watching Marcus over the rim. He drank deeply from his own beer, which confused me for a moment until I realized he probably knew exactly what was and wasn't safe to consume. While Marcus launched into an elaborate speech about how much our relationship meant to him and how excited he was about our future together, I took the opportunity to study him more carefully. His behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and unnatural. One moment he'd be making intense, uncomfortable eye contact, the next he'd be nervously checking his phone. His voice kept shifting between the uncertain tone I'd heard earlier and a more confident, almost aggressive delivery. That's when he opened the briefcase he'd brought from his car and spread several official-looking documents across our small table. The papers were printed on expensive letterhead and contained multiple signature lines highlighted in yellow. "This is that estate planning strategy I mentioned earlier," Marcus explained, pointing to various sections with the confidence of someone who'd made this presentation many times before. "Essentially, you temporarily transfer ownership of your major assets to me for tax purposes. Your house, your investment accounts, your life insurance policies. Then at the end of the fiscal year, I transfer everything back to you, but you've saved thousands of dollars in capital gains and inheritance taxes. It's completely legal, and lots of families use these strategies." I started reading through the documents, carefully drawing on my 3 decades of experience in the insurance industry. These weren't estate planning forms. They were transfer of ownership documents, beneficiary change forms, and power of attorney papers that would give Marcus complete legal control over every aspect of my financial life. Worse, I recognized the law firm letterhead on several of the forms. It belonged to an attorney I'd worked with years ago, but I knew for certain he'd retired and closed his practice in 2019. When I questioned the authenticity of the documents, Marcus's friendly facade cracked slightly. "Dad, you trust me, right?" he said, and there was an edge to his voice that made my skin crawl. "I'm your only family left. Mom's getting older too, and someone needs to make sure you're both protected if something happens." Then he started telling stories about our shared past, trying to reinforce our emotional connection. But the details were completely wrong. He talked about a fishing trip to Lake Michigan where he'd caught his first bass, but Marcus had always been afraid of water, and we'd never been fishing together. He mentioned my attendance at his high school graduation party, but I'd been traveling for work that week and had missed the ceremony entirely. He referenced camping trips and baseball games and father-son bonding moments that simply never happened. Either Marcus had somehow lost all memory of his actual childhood, or the man sitting across from me wasn't my son at all. When I refused to sign the papers, immediately insisting I needed time to review them with my own attorney, Marcus's grip on my forearm became painful. His smile remained fixed in place, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "Think about it overnight, Dad," he said, his fingers digging into my skin. "But don't wait too long. These tax deadlines are pretty strict, and missing them could cost you thousands of dollars." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. I was running out of time, and whatever was going to happen to me was going to happen soon. I told Marcus I needed to use the restroom and wanted to take the documents with me so I could read through them more carefully in better lighting. He seemed reluctant to let the papers out of his sight, but I insisted that making such important financial decisions required careful consideration. Once locked inside the small bathroom, I spread the documents across the narrow counter and examined them under the harsh fluorescent bulbs. My years in insurance had taught me exactly what to look for in forged documents, and these contained several red flags. The font on the law firm letterhead was slightly different from what I remembered. The paper quality wasn't quite right for official legal documents. Some of the legal language was outdated, using terminology that had been phased out years ago. More disturbing were the personal details scattered throughout the paperwork. My social security number, my mother's maiden name, my first apartment address from 1985, even my high school yearbook quote. This level of detailed personal information could only have come from extensive identity theft research. Someone had spent months, possibly years, studying every aspect of my life. I could hear Marcus outside the bathroom door, pacing back and forth, occasionally knocking and asking if I was okay. His voice sounded increasingly agitated, and I could hear him having brief, hushed phone conversations with someone. That's when I noticed the bathroom had a small window that opened onto the alley behind the building. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but I was desperate. I pushed the window open as quietly as possible and managed to climb through, though my jacket caught on the frame and I had to leave it behind to avoid making noise. The alley was narrow and dark, lined with dumpsters and storage containers. From there, I could see through the bar's side windows back into the main dining area. Marcus was still at our table, but now he was talking animatedly on his phone, clearly frustrated about something. His body language was aggressive and urgent, completely different from the nervous, apologetic demeanor he'd shown me all evening. Within minutes, 2 men entered the Anchor and joined Marcus at our table. One was older, maybe 60 years old, with silver hair and an expensive-looking overcoat. The other was younger and heavily muscled, wearing sunglasses despite the dim interior lighting. The three of them had an intense conversation with Marcus, gesturing toward the bathroom and explaining something that was clearly not going according to plan. The older man made a phone call, spoke briefly, then hung up and said something to his companions. All three stood up, left money on the table, and headed toward the front exit. I watched them get into a black SUV with tinted windows and pull out of the parking lot. I waited a few minutes to make sure they were really gone, then began following the SUV's route from a safe distance. They drove through the residential area and into an industrial section of Portland, where empty warehouses and abandoned buildings lined poorly lit streets. I managed to keep up by staying in shadows and using parked cars for cover, always maintaining at least a block between myself and their vehicle. They stopped at a large warehouse complex with multiple loading bays. Most of the building was dark, but I could see lights in a few windows and activity around one of the dock areas. I watched from behind a row of garbage containers as the three men unloaded several large plastic storage containers from their SUV, the kind of containers that could easily hold a human body. I found a payphone outside a closed auto repair shop and called 911, reporting suspicious activity at the warehouse address. I described what I'd witnessed and mentioned the connection to missing persons cases, but I realized the police would need concrete evidence and probable cause to obtain a search warrant. By the time they cut through the legal red tape, these criminals might destroy evidence and disappear. I had to gather proof myself, and I had to do it quickly. The warehouse complex had multiple entrances. The main loading dock was brightly lit and secured with electronic locks, but I found a side entrance near the employee parking area where someone had propped a door open, probably for smoking brakes. I slipped inside, my heart pounding so hard I was certain anyone nearby would hear it. The interior was enormous, filled with shipping containers, industrial machinery, and rows of metal shelving that created a maze of corridors and hiding spots. In one corner of the building, I could see a makeshift office area with filing cabinets, desks, computers, and bulletin boards covered with papers and photographs. I made my way there carefully, using the shadows between containers and equipment to avoid detection. The office area was unoccupied, but clearly in active use, with computers still running and recent paperwork scattered across the desk surfaces. The filing cabinets were unlocked, probably because the criminals never expected anyone to break into their operation. Inside, I discovered folders containing detailed information about dozens of elderly men. Each folder included photographs, complete financial records, family histories, medical information, psychological profiles, and forged legal documents identical to the ones Marcus had shown me at the bar. Harold Peterson, the man in the blue vest from Jake's security photos. Robert Chen, the balding man in the brown sweater. But there were many more names. William Rodriguez, George Thompson, Frederick Walsh, Thomas Murphy, page after page of victims who had trusted the wrong people and paid with their lives. Then I found a folder with my own name on it, Dennis Mitchell. The file was thick, containing information that made my blood run cold. My high school yearbook photo, college transcripts, employment records from every job I'd ever held. Copies of my divorce papers. Medical records going back 15 years, bank statements, tax returns, and hundreds of surveillance photographs taken without my knowledge over the past several months. Pictures of me grocery shopping, visiting my doctor, walking my neighbor's dog, sitting on my front porch reading the newspaper, even sleeping in my own bed taken through my bedroom window. Someone had been stalking me extensively, learning my routines, my habits, my vulnerabilities. At the bottom of the folder was a death certificate template with my name already filled in. Cause of death, accidental drowning. Estimated date within the next 48 hours, just like Harold Peterson's accident. That's when I heard voices echoing through the warehouse, getting closer to my location. Multiple sets of footsteps moving purposefully through the building, conducting what sounded like a systematic search. They'd discovered my escape from the bathroom and had returned to the warehouse to either clean up evidence or deal with loose ends. I quickly photographed every document in my folder with my smartphone, uploading the images immediately to my email account in case something happened to me. Then I found a storage closet filled with janitorial supplies and squeezed inside, leaving the door slightly ajar so I could see and hear what was happening outside. Marcus and his two associates were conducting a methodical sweep of the warehouse, checking every container, every hiding spot, every possible place where someone might conceal themselves. As they moved closer to my area, I could hear their conversation clearly. The man I'd thought was my son was giving orders to the others, and his voice was completely different now. Gone was any trace of the nervous, apologetic tone he'd used with me at dinner. This was someone accustomed to command someone comfortable with violence and intimidation. "We need to find him tonight," the fake Marcus said. "If he contacts police, this entire operation is finished. I've spent 2 years building this identity, learning every detail about his family, and I'm not losing everything because some old man got suspicious." "What about the body?" asked the younger man in sunglasses. "Same as the others. Stage it to look like an accident. The old fool's been drinking, loses his footing near the river, falls in and drowns. Happens to elderly men all the time." That's when I heard the most devastating revelation of all. The real Marcus, my actual son, had been dead for over a year. He'd died in a car accident, and this man named Tyler had somehow manipulated the scene to make it appear that Marcus had simply left town without telling anyone. Tyler had then stolen my son's identity, undergone plastic surgery to match his appearance, and spent months studying our family history to pull off this elaborate fraud. My son had been gone for 13 months, and I'd never even known to grieve for him. The sound of police sirens in the distance told me my 911 call had finally prompted a response, but I could hear the criminals beginning to destroy evidence. They were throwing documents into metal trash barrels and setting them on fire, filling the warehouse with smoke and the acrid smell of burning paper. I waited until they were distracted by the approaching emergency vehicles, then slipped out of my hiding spot and made my way toward the nearest exit. Outside, I flagged down the first police car that arrived and identified myself as the caller who had reported the suspicious activity. The photographic evidence on my phone was enough to convince the officers to immediately raid the warehouse. What they found inside exceeded even my worst fears. In addition to the extensive files documenting dozens of elderly victims across multiple states, police discovered 3 bodies in the industrial freezer containers I'd seen them unloading from the SUV. Harold Peterson, who'd supposedly died in an accidental drowning. Robert Chen, who'd disappeared after mentioning an investment meeting. And most heartbreaking of all, my real son Marcus, whose death had been the foundation for this entire elaborate con game. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of Tyler's operation. He was the leader of a sophisticated elder fraud ring that had been operating for over 5 years, targeting recently divorced or widowed men with substantial assets and complicated family relationships. They would identify victims through public records, obituaries, social media profiles, and court documents, then spend months researching their backgrounds, financial situations, and family dynamics. Tyler's specialty was assuming the identities of deceased family members using plastic surgery, voice coaching, and extensive preparation to impersonate sons, nephews, or grandsons who had become estranged from their elderly relatives. The psychological manipulation was particularly cruel because it exploited victims' desires to reconnect with loved ones and heal damaged relationships. When my real son died in what appeared to be a single car accident on a rainy night outside Portland, Tyler had been monitoring our family for months, waiting for the right opportunity. He arranged for the accident scene to be cleaned up before police could conduct a thorough investigation, making it look like Marcus had simply decided to leave town and start over somewhere new. Then Tyler began the process of becoming Marcus, using medical records to guide his surgical alterations and spending nearly a year perfecting his impersonation. The periodic phone calls and rare visits were designed to gradually reintroduce himself into my life without raising suspicion about the gaps in his knowledge or changes in his personality. He'd been planning to eventually convince me to visit him in person, where he could execute the final phase of his plan in a controlled environment. During the trial, prosecutors revealed that Tyler's ring had stolen over $8 million from elderly victims across 7 states and was responsible for at least 15 murders. The fake investment opportunities, estate planning scams, and financial emergencies were all carefully crafted to pressure victims into quickly transferring their assets before they had time to think critically about the situations. Tyler received a life sentence without possibility of parole. His accomplices were sentenced to terms ranging from 25 to 40 years in federal prison. But knowing they would never hurt anyone else couldn't bring back my real son or erase the trauma of learning that I'd been talking to his killer while believing I was rebuilding our relationship. The grief of losing Marcus hit me twice as hard because I'd never properly mourned his death when it actually happened. For over a year, I'd been carrying guilt about our distant relationship and hoping we'd eventually find our way back to each other, not knowing he was already gone. I found a letter Marcus had written to me just 3 weeks before his death, expressing regret about how our relationship had deteriorated after the divorce and his sincere desire to rebuild our connection. He'd been planning to visit me for Christmas, hoping we could start fresh and heal some of the wounds from our family's breakup. Tyler had intercepted that letter and used the emotional content to make his impersonation more convincing and manipulative. The healing process required over a year of intensive therapy support groups for families of fraud victims and gradually learning to trust people again. I had to rebuild my ability to form relationships while carrying the knowledge that someone had studied me so thoroughly they could manipulate my deepest emotional needs. I became an advocate for elder fraud awareness, speaking at community centers, senior facilities, and law enforcement training sessions about the sophisticated psychological manipulation tactics used by modern con artists. My experience helped other families recognize warning signs and taught investigators about the elaborate preparation that goes into these crimes. Jake, the bartender, whose quick thinking and willingness to get involved had literally saved my life, became one of my closest friends. His courage in warning a stranger about danger, despite the personal risk, restored some of my faith in human decency during a very dark period. I learned that trusting your instincts isn't just important for daily decision-making. It can be the difference between life and death. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are wearing the faces of those we love, using our deepest emotions as weapons against us. But there are still genuinely good people like Jake who will risk their own safety to protect strangers from harm. And sometimes fighting back isn't just about personal survival. It's about getting justice for victims who can't fight for themselves anymore. I visit my real son's grave twice a month now, finally able to properly say goodbye and tell him how proud I am of the man he'd become, even though our relationship was complicated and unresolved when he died. I also leave flowers for Harold and Robert, whose families found some comfort in knowing their loved ones' deaths weren't accidental and that their killers faced justice. Have you ever encountered someone who seemed to know too much about your personal life or family history? Have you noticed warning signs that someone close to you might not be who they claim to be? Share your experiences in the comments, because your story could help someone else recognize these dangerous red flags before it's too late. If this story opened your eyes to the sophisticated tactics used by elder fraud criminals, please give it a like and share it with family members or friends who might be vulnerable to these kinds of psychological manipulation schemes. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that expose the darker sides of human nature while also celebrating the everyday heroes who help us survive and seek justice. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that staying alert, trusting your gut feelings, and looking out for each other could save someone's life. Stay safe out there and keep protecting the people you care about.